One of my coping mechanisms for when something stressful happens is that I try and read as much as I can about it. So when the pandemic hit, I tried to get as many books on disease as I could find. Now, it might not have been the most optimistic, positive reading out there in the world, but I did learn a lot. I found a book on smallpox. I found a book on yellow fever, the AIDS epidemic, the 1918 flu. Here's one on malaria and the Black Death. There's one about cholera around here too. And then just general ones about epidemics and disease in general. Now, even though they weren't optimistic and uplifting, there were a ton of lessons that I learned from them. Patterns that you find repeat over and over and over again throughout history. And there are crucial differences between each one of these. You could probably make a couple of sermons out of this history, if not many more. I want to focus on one particular lesson I learned in all this study, and it is this. As a country, as a species, we do not tell the story of disease very well. We barely tell it at all, but we should. For example, here are a few important historical realities that have shaped our world today that happened because of epidemics and disease. Number one, Canada exists as a country. It exists because the American Army during the Revolutionary War went to Canada and got wrecked by smallpox and had to turn back. Number two, France sold the United States the Louisiana Purchase because French forces in Haiti were devastated by yellow fever. And Napoleon was so concerned about this that he decided it was no longer worth keeping French soldiers and defending American colonies. So get rid of the Louisiana territories. And during the 1918 flu, not that long ago in the tide of history, when here in the United States victims died, their families received generous life insurance payouts and often let them invest and become wealthy, as it did with a victim named Frederick Trump and his family, whose family took the money and invested it into New York City real estate. These are only a few examples of the untold stories that disease have influenced. Disease seems to lurk under almost every surface and every single event in history, even in our beloved church building. You know how gray and solemn and serious and dignified it can look? That's because the architect based it on a style of Gothic architecture that was popular following the Black Death. When you lose 1/3 or 1/2 of everyone around you, you're going to want an architecture that is gray and solemn and serious. So when many of us think of history, we think of the history of war. Certainly my history class is centered on that. Or they looked at history through the lens of great men, and they were usually great men to these history books, seeing the influence of certain individuals as pivotal of history. But of course, that obscures the history and what was happening to everyone else, to other real people, deeper history. For example, in 2017, the Library of Congress listed roughly 800,000 books about World War I. The deaths from that war, the war that we hear about all the time in our history books, were roughly 40 million people. Now that's huge, and it's a story worth being told. But that flu, the influenza that struck the world at that exact same time, it killed 50 million people. That's 10 million more than the First World War. But in the Library of Congress, there are not 880,000 books about the flu. There are only 400. Now, historians have reflected on why the dominant narrative in American society has basically ignored or forgotten or refused to tell the story of disease. even though the real impact on human lives from it has been immense. The author of Pale Rider, a book on the 1918 flu, Laura Spiney, suggests that there are reasons that are a combination of factors. One is that people like clarity in their history and storytelling, and that disease with its hard-to-count deaths and rarely clear endpoints makes a good, strong story hard to tell. Others suggest that disease was just more commonplace in the past and thus less newsworthy. We know that infant mortality rates were so much higher back in the day, and maybe people just took it as another sign that they could not control the world. But there's one important reason that is especially relevant today that comes through all these histories as well. The reason why we don't learn about disease, know about disease, is that those who suffer most from it are not those who write the history books. When yellow fever hit Memphis, Tennessee in 1878, the well-off fled the city. Those who had no place to go had to stay. Who couldn't afford to leave had to stay. And 1/3 of those Memphis folks died. A horrible death to yellow fever. Or when Europeans arrived in the Americas. The story I was told that it was empty. They passed down stories of wide open prairies, of barren wilderness, of somehow how Cortez with a few hundred soldiers was able to take down a powerful Aztec empire, suggesting the cunning and the technology and the advancement of those Spaniards. But the New World was only wide open and barren and vulnerable to Cortez because the Europeans had brought smallpox with them. Depending on the data, there are reason to believe that European disease killed close to 90% of all indigenous people in America. Just think about how staggering that must be. Think about how much human suffering there must have been, and how you can't tell the story of America without knowing that. Yet I didn't learn it. You can't tell the story of America without talking about that unless you don't believe that those people's lives and families and cultures don't matter. Imagine the psychological toll that such death and loss must cause. Whole towns wiped out, whole societies. Imagine the disruption to even practical things like growing food. Here today, we know that there's disruption with this virus that we have. There's less food on the shelves. People are staying at home. Culture is changing. And yet the death toll today isn't anywhere near what it was. But most of us learn our history as if it never happened. It was America's manifest destiny to settle the West. The European takeover was inevitable because they were more advanced or organized or whatever else. It doesn't even end there. Do you know how many people died of smallpox in the 20th century? That century in history class, when we learned all about World War I and World War II and the Great Depression and maybe Vietnam, as if those were the most important things. How many people died of smallpox in the 20th century? It was 300 million. That's incredible. I never learned that. I bet many of you never learned that. Who were those people? What was their story? Why do our history books not tell it? Probably because those who write those history books, those who run our media, don't see those 300 million people as their own. They weren't my family. It happened far away in other countries, poor families, poor countries, that American history books and news don't think of. With each epidemic, the story repeats. It happened with smallpox, and the 1918 flu, and even with the AIDS epidemic, which devastated the queer community not that long ago here in New York City. We forget that this virus today is not the first virus to impact our city, even in our own lifetime. Those who are hardest hit often can't write the history books because often they don't survive. Or they're far enough on the margins that those in the center don't care. Or it takes years for their stories to emerge. And they emerge only after the courage and perseverance of those affected. Now, we hear a lot about people talking about how we are all in this together, or in how this virus doesn't discriminate. But that's simply nonsense. It's not true. The virus might not care who you are because it doesn't care much about anything other than reproducing. But that doesn't mean it doesn't infect people indiscriminately. It doesn't mean we're all at the same level of risk. Those who have been able to afford good health insurance and good health care their entire life are, of course, going to be at an advantage and more healthy and more able to combat the infections. Those who are used to advocating for themselves or are more familiar with health care or speak the language and culture of the medical staff are, of course, going to get better care. And those of us, like me, who have the privilege of staying home, of sheltering in place, whose jobs don't require them to leave, take transit, we're going to be safer. I don't have to make a choice between my safety and my paycheck. Now, we've seen this inequality here in New York. We've seen in the papers about how you see that New York is an epicenter of this outbreak. But what we really mean is that the boroughs are. And what we really mean is that certain communities are, and certain communities where essential workers live, those people who take the train to their jobs to deliver groceries, or stock shelves, or watch the doors to apartment buildings. Or those people who are in immigrant communities or in black and brown communities who don't have the resources and have been historically marginalized. They can't afford not to work. These are the kind of people who would never dare to show up to a state capitol and yell and make national news while being heavily armed because they know all too well how that would end. It would be insincere and insulting for someone like me with the privilege I have to draw parallels between my experience of this virus and their experience. I say safe and sound. They risk their lives every day. I have a nice home, a stable job, good health insurance. And that's true for a whole lot of people that I know. And predictably, they are all still alive. There is so much to learn from this moment of history. But one of the greatest lessons is this: we are not the same in times of disaster and disease. In times of crisis, inequality and injustice are deepened, not eliminated. We have to know this: false unity is a tool to gloss over the deepest suffering. It is a tool to keep us ignorant of the gross unfairness of society. It takes the experience of the best of us, the best off, and pretends it's the experience of everyone, rewriting history and cutting off at the knees any notion that things are not okay and the status quo must change. That's why people in power now and throughout any of these history books, they try to downplay the disease. Because if people were to pay attention to it, it will reveal a truth, that our priorities are wrong, that our society is not as fair and equal as we believe it is. And if you are a leader or someone invested in the status quo, people learning those things feels very dangerous and very unsettling. But we must not let the truth be hidden. We have the opportunity this time around to tell the right story. And we can throw out the pernicious platitudes of unity and togetherness and replace them with a hardened commitment to justice and systematic change. We can make a commitment to look beyond what is presented to us in the mainstream, knowing always, this is a wonderful rule of thumb, that those most impacted, those most suffering, are not those that are most featured in the headlines. We are not all in this together. And we never were. And we won't be until we lift up and honor the true suffering, the real suffering of those people who are suffering the most. This is sobering, and it is still very real. Someday I pray we all will be in it together. And I am sorry that it is not today. But it can start today. If we learn from the past, if we listen to the present, and we make changes for the future, we can tell better stories, truer stories, this time, this moment. May it be so, and amen.